Good afternoon, everyone. I think some of us are still eating dessert, so please feel free to continue. We'd like to get started with the program for this afternoon, but please continue with your coffee and dessert. Before we do get started, I'd like to ask you to put your cell phones on silent, turn them off, or just put them on silent, please. So, spring has sprung. Finally, yes. So that must means we're getting time to put our winter coats away, but, well, wait a minute, this is Kentucky. So you need to kind of just hold on to those coats a little bit longer because you may need to use them. I understand come Saturday, you may have to use them this Saturday, so I'm not just going to say anything more about that. But we welcome everyone back. We're glad to see some familiar faces. We have some new people with us today, so we hope you enjoy your stay with us today, and hopefully you'll come back and visit with us next time. Before we start today's program, we have several announcements real quick. In the back of the room, there is a commemorative brick and leaf program table. If you care to stop by there and take a look at that, commemorative bricks and leaves are wonderful ways to create a lasting tribute to your loved ones, our veterans, and a way to appreciate the ultimate sacrifice of our soldiers. All the bricks purchased by April 30th will be dedicated on June the 4th, which is Boone Day, our celebration at that time. For those purchasing commemorative leaves, a dedication ceremony will be held in the fall. So if you have questions regarding either of these programs, please see Stephen Claytos. He will be at the table in the back at the conclusion of our program today. Next month, we welcome Dr. Melissa McEwen and Dr. Thomas Appleton for a lecture and book signing of Kentucky Women, Their Lives and Times. Their book, which is a collection of essays, covers all areas of the Commonwealth to show the remarkable achievements of women in history, economics, politics, and the arts. Now, today, we welcome Emily Bingham. Mrs. Bingham is an independent historian located in Louisville and a frequent visiting professor at Centre College. The project from which today's talk is drawn, Irrepressible, The Jazz Age Life of Henrietta Bingham, was published in 2015. It has been called Haunting by The New Yorker and is a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award in LGBT literature. The Wall Street Journal's Edward Costner wrote that Henrietta Bingham was one of those entrancing creatures more often met in books than in life. And Emily Bingham's painstaking reconstruction of Henrietta's story shows that she was a pioneer of sorts, a poignant case of a life unspooled before the world was ready for her. Mrs. Bingham will be available to sign her book over here to my left at the conclusion of her program. So please join me in welcoming Emily Bingham.
Thank you. Oh, you're very welcome. So thank you, all of you, for coming out of the beautiful sunshine and into this lovely room and this incredible institution. Is everybody hearing me well? Hands up? Great. Okay. I love the History Center. I love coming to Frankfurt. I love Poor Richard's. I stop in every time I come. And I have spoken here before, but this is an amazing crowd, so I feel very blessed. I also want to say thank you to my mother who came from Louisville to see me speak, not for the first time. I promised her it would be different every time, so if you all ever have a chance to see me again, even if I talk about this book, it'll be different. And she has been just a total rock of support as I journeyed into our family history and really helped me in just a thousand different ways all along. So did other family members, and so did many in the historical community here in Kentucky. So any kind of history, especially with a local subject like this, builds on local history. And so I have been able to, through the goodwill and support of so many, I've been able to access records and papers and photographs that have helped me build this composite of Henrietta. So there had been plenty of books written about members of the Bingham family, and I had absolutely no intention or interest, even though I'm a trained historian and a member of the family, of contributing to them, to that shelf. I went through the sale of the companies when I was in college, and it was kind of a searing time, and I didn't have any interest in revisiting it, and really thought I had nothing to add to it. However, there was this person in the history of our family who just popped up on a very marginal way. I knew very little about her. I knew that Henrietta Bingham was a horsewoman. She was my grandfather, Barry Bingham Sr.'s older sister, and she loved horses, and I loved horses, and so that's kind of what I knew. I remember her being talked about occasionally in the family, but it was always in a sort of, well, she wasn't really very interesting. That's what I picked up. My father did have one funny story that he repeated when her name would come up. He would say that when he and his parents were sometimes going on road trips in Kentucky, and Henrietta would be along for the trip, that they would stop for lunch in some little place, and you'd look the other way, and before you knew it, the bacon would be gone from your BLT. And it was her. But that was funny, it got a laugh, and then we would move on, right? That is how she was presented to me. So I never imagined writing a book. This is just a birth announcement from 1998. My husband and I were expecting a child. I didn't know if it was a girl or not, but it turned out to be. And my plan to name her Sophie was derailed when I think I got my 5th birth announcement for a Sophie that year. I just didn't want to do that to her. So I just started thinking about other old-fashioned Victorian names, and my husband and I thought, well, no one has used Henrietta. It's strong, it's sort of cool. There's Etta James, we could always call her that, and so that's what happened. My father came to the hospital room where we were, and he had a little bit of an ashen cast to his complexion, and he said, "I don't know how you could do that and name her that." And I said, "Well, I guess we have something to talk about because I don't know what you mean." And he did fill me in afterwards about some of the sad scenes that he had experienced with his great aunt Henrietta in the 40s and especially the 50s. For instance, seeing her wheeled out of the family house in a coma. But after my Henrietta was born, things started to come to me. Stories were told to me in social settings. I got photographs. I was given linen sheets and jewelry that had some connection to Henrietta. But it was especially the stories that kept filtering out about this woman that bore very little connection to the image I had had of her growing up as a child. So she seemed to be extremely vibrant and alive in people's memories, and they'd been waiting for a way to talk about her again. And then she also was showing up in some books about the Bloomsbury Group, which we'll touch on later. She would be, those were coming out in the 80s and 90s, and I was seeing her in the indexes and learning a little bit more about her from that. But there were no diaries or letters of hers that anyone knew of to speak of. And when I went to my editor and said, "I just think there's this story here," he just said, "Emily, there is, what do you have?" And I said, "Well, a lot of stories." He said, "There is no book, but I'm really stubborn." And thank you to my family for making me stubborn. And I kept digging. And what I found that through archives in both this country and England, there were enough traces of Henrietta Bingham and her effect, her profound effect on other people, that and that really her presence was stronger than I could ever have imagined compared to my family's memory as it was passed to me. So that did become a book, as you all know, obviously. And in that book, I just want to say my overall message and experience is how much we can learn about both history and ourselves when we really dig into families. We all experience life in a family. We can't escape that. And so I also think it is a powerful way to talk about history. And we can all identify with being a child or a sibling or a parent. But we do have members of families who are forgotten or are, marginalized, or as I like to say, pruned. And when you put those people back into the picture, the whole tree can change and look different. So I just encourage anyone to think about that in their own family and talk especially to the elder people in their lives who might have more knowledge than you thought there was. So this afternoon, I'm just going to take you through 4 phases of Henrietta's extraordinarily passionate and dramatic and very international life. But I'm going to keep the focus on her roots and her love for her home state of Kentucky. So there's a lot more that isn't in this talk, and I hope if you haven't read the book and you find it interesting, you'll be tempted to read more. So Henrietta came into the world in a house on 4th Street in Old Louisville, the neighborhood of Old Louisville, which my grandfather, I think, wonderfully described as an exclamation point on the landscape of Louisville architecture. And it's no longer standing, but it was quite a statement, let's say. Her parents, this is a portrait of her father, Robert Worth Bingham, and her mother, Eleanor Miller. So Eleanor was called Babes, by the way. I like that. Her mother was from a family that had gained great wealth in the cast iron industry, starting with stoves and engines and moving into pipe. And so in the late 19th century and early 20th century, they were supplying pipes for many, many cities across the area, region, and country, installing water systems. Her father, Robert Worth Bingham, came from a long line of educators from North Carolina, and he had no desire to continue to be a schoolmaster in a boarding school outside of Asheville, North Carolina. He had set his sights on something more exciting, he thought, than that. And when he married Eleanor, moved to Louisville, he was very intent. He got his law degree, and he was intent on breaking into politics. He did serve as interim mayor of Louisville in 1906 when Henrietta was just 5 years old. She was born in 1901. And he was appointed by Governor Beckham after a terribly filthy election, supposedly the worst, most corrupt election in the state of Kentucky's history. And that's probably a pretty dirty history. Well, Henrietta comes along, and here she is. It's pretty clear from this image, I think, that she was a tomboy early on. Her boots are too big for her feet, and they're on the wrong side, wrong feet. She is riding a tricycle in boys' clothes, and she has a look of total determination on her face. But she also clearly liked to dress up. This image of her as a Rough Rider also posed on the back. It's right at the back of her birthplace home, which is actually her grandmother's house. Her parents were living with her grandmother. So here she's been posed on a table with a piece of fabric, and she's dressed up as this, Teddy Roosevelt type, and heading to the Alamo or something. But she also has a gaze. And one poet who knew her when she was in college and beyond said that Henrietta could look her eyes into you. And one thing that doesn't show up in any of these images, or that anything I've ever seen, is her unbelievable violet eyes. I have to think they were something like Elizabeth Taylor's eyes, that just beamed out of her face, and nobody could not notice her because of that. She was an athlete. Here she is in her swimming costume, but she was a great swimmer, a great tennis player, a really amazing horsewoman, and a daring fox hunter. So she and her family finally moved out of their grandmother's house in Old Louisville to the new, very desirable section of town called the Highlands, right around the recently designed Olmsted Cherokee Park. And this is one of the entrances to the park. In the spring of 1913, just as she turned 12, her family was headed out to Pee Wee Valley for a Sunday in the country, and the car she and many of her family members were riding in was struck by an interurban on the rail track, and her mother died a few hours later, and Henrietta was in the car with her. This was, a devastating thing for any child, of course, but her father comes through in my story as being perhaps the most devastated. And at the age that Henrietta was, she took on the role of cheering him. She had an older brother who was away at boarding school at the time, and a younger brother, my grandfather. And she was in a position and took on this role of trying to make her dad feel better after this loss. But she also had boyfriends, and I love this little early photo reel of one of them, John Mason Brown, who became a well-known lecturer, but he was a theater critic and grew up nearby her in Old Louisville. And in 8th and 9th grade, he kept a line-a-day diary, which someone at the Filson Historical Society told me about. And there Henrietta was, all over his puppy love diary. His enthusiasm, even as a boy, for her, I think presages really the amazing kind of responses she got from all kinds of people, and I will say right now, men and women alike. He said, "I went to call on Henrietta. I stayed to dinner. She cooking me an egg. Really, no food ever tasted better or was better cooked. Oh, how happy I am." And the next day, they snuck into a movie together, and who knows what happened then. But the relationship didn't last very long, but he was smitten with her for many, many years. This is the kind of double dating she might have done at Fountain Ferry Park, famous amusement park in West Louisville that was closed in the 60s because the owners didn't want to desegregate the park. And then Henrietta, was not just keeping up her father's spirits and flirting with, boys like John Mason Brown. Here you have a picture of the Louisville Country Club's reception room. And if there's one place I'd like to see a historical marker to Henrietta, it would be here, right outside, a state historical marker. There's an incredible story I heard way before I even thought of doing a book, about a debutante party that was happening here in the teens. And apparently, Henrietta and another debutante were in the ladies' powder room together, and something happened, and the debutante came streaking out of the powder room and leaned over this grand staircase, which is about where this photographer is standing, and shouted to everyone who was coming in that Henrietta Bingham just kissed me on the lips. So through the 20s, Henrietta, and much of the 30s, Henrietta had a foot in London and another in Kentucky. This beautiful, violet-eyed American hostess who knew everything about jazz had that kind of inexhaustible charm that F. Scott Fitzgerald describes in The Great Gatsby about the lovely centerpiece of Gatsby's attention, which included having the jingle of money. So her father was a well-off guy, and she was spending some of that money in London. She hadn't quite graduated from college. She left Smith College without a degree. In fact, was asked not to return. But She had a pretty good time while she was there, I think, and she was in London, in fact, with one of her Smith College professors. Her English teacher took her there with her on sabbatical. But she was taking London by storm. On the left, we have Tallulah Bankhead, who was her age and was all the rage on the stage there. She and Henrietta had knew each other for many years, put it that way. And then on the right, Crown Prince Nicholas of Romania was another who was taking an interest in her. But her father was funding this partly, and could fund it partly because of the second marriage that so I'm going to back up a little to Henrietta's teens when he married for a second time. This is a portrait of his second wife, Mary Lily, not a portrait, a photo of Mary Lily Keenan Flagler with her husband, Standard Oil magnate and railroad builder Henry Flagler. And Henry Flagler and Henrietta's mother died in the same year, and Henrietta's dad and Mary Lily had known each other in North Carolina as young people. So they get together. Mary Lily was considered the richest woman in America. This was the wedding present Henry Flagler built for her in Palm Beach. It's called Whitehall, and you can visit it today. It's open to the public. It's extremely impressive. And this kind of fabulous wealth was, catapulted Henrietta's father into a whole new category where he could talk about being a senator, for instance. At least that's what he thought. But there were two problems. One is that this is about how Henrietta felt about the marriage. She did not like Mary Lily. And the second is that in just within 8 months of the marriage, this kind of headline was splashed across newspapers all over the country. Mary Lily died under circumstances that led some in her family to cry foul play. And despite that, and I will say that I don't think there was foul play. But it was a mysterious and unfortunate death. And so Henrietta's father received in a codicil to a will $5 million, but also a shadow of suspicion that followed him for the rest of his life every single place he went, including when he would visit with Franklin Roosevelt at the White House, and apparently Roosevelt would sometimes refer to him after he left the room as my favorite murderer. But in joking, right? We're all joking. So with some of that money, as many of you know, Robert Worth Bingham, Henrietta's dad, bought the Louisville Courier-Journal, and it enabled him to escape the practice of law and place himself in a position to shape public affairs in Louisville and Kentucky and beyond. So he has this extremely talented, extremely magnetic daughter who's in London while he's starting to do all that. Henrietta channeled her rebellion into music, and largely black music. This is actually an arrangement of a traditional song by a Louisville man, Avery Robinson, and it's a convict song. Now, black music in general was coming into total vogue, so she was not unique in this, but Henrietta embraced it with an enthusiasm and special care. She didn't care that some people thought it was, wrong or too risque or any of that. She had no interest. She, in fact, went to the music store in Louisville when she was a teenager and charged to her father a saxophone. And she carried that saxophone around with her to Europe and to college and all that, and she actually played. In 1923 in London, she was asked to come to a party given by a novelist and bookseller named David Garnett. He was turning 30, he had a new hit novella, and he had this new American friend who he thought was pretty special. And invited to that party were members of an illustrious group of writers and intellectuals called the members of the Bloomsbury Group. So this was really her entree into a remarkable group of people in England. She sings this song to a mandolin, and in her sort of low, husky voice, and the way that she embodied a song about a convict bringing water, or asking for water, rather, and she talks about sweat, and she talks about pain and, being exhausted. She was crossing boundaries of race and certainly of social status and nationality in a way that captivated these people. And this is just a reference point to the kind of art that was being created by members of the Bloomsbury group. This was the house where some of them lived. Virginia Woolf's sister lived in this house. So in any case, in London, she becomes one of very few Americans to find their way into this group that had formed around Virginia Woolf and her friends and her sister, the painter Vanessa Bell. Here we have Lytton Strachey with Virginia Woolf at that time, just around the time they met Henrietta. Lytton Strachey reportedly was the only member of this group who anyone thought Henrietta could get through a night in his room without being attacked, because everyone else was falling for her. She also introduced African-American artists. This is particularly one I'm interested in because she's from Louisville, named Edith Wilson, into this group of people. She had her own fancy party in the spring of 1923, where she invited the whole cast of an all-black cast play, then touring in London, called From Dover Street to Dixie. And Edith Wilson was one of the dancers and performers in that. At the end of the part, and by the way, apparently she claimed that John C. Breckinridge the Confederate general, was her grandfather, Edith Wilson. At the end of the party, Henrietta, in a purple dress, climbed on the piano and began playing her sax. One of the people who fell for Henrietta very hard was an artist named Dora Carrington. And here's a nude of Dora, and then a nude that Dora sketched of Henrietta in wearing only bedroom slippers with a little heel on them. That is in the collection of the Duke of Devonshire. So meanwhile, while Henrietta is out in London making this huge splash, her father it really wants her to come home, and he has a particular project that he's pursuing, that he's writing letters to her about constantly, and it has to do with tobacco. Her father was engaged in his own sort of dramatic campaign, which involved acknowledging how following World War I, the price of tobacco was collapsed, and many, just tens of thousands of farmers across the state were in really hitting hard times. He had seen how big companies like this one, the American Tobacco Company in Louisville, were squeezing the lifeblood out of a bedrock part of the Kentucky economy. So he led an effort, and he wasn't the only one by any means, but he got very involved. He rolled up his sleeves and led this effort to protect farmers with a pool or cooperative system that laid the groundwork for the later tobacco cooperative that we all are probably familiar with, that sustained Kentucky tobacco for half a century from the 40s into the 90s. He invested more than $1 million of his own money into the cooperative, giving it the capital it needed to build the warehouses and so forth. He hired an organizer, and he, with the organizer, was going around the state recruiting farmers to join the pool. And because of all this work, there was a lot of talk about him becoming governor and so on. And meanwhile, he was always calling Henrietta to come home, help me with my work, I need you here. In early 1923, Henrietta also began treatment with the most important psychoanalyst in England, Ernest Jones. Ernest Jones is pictured here with your more familiar face, Sigmund Freud, whom he spirited out of Vienna during the Anschluss in 1937. But in 23, he was a younger psychoanalyst and the most important person promulgating Freud's theories. It's really hard to know exactly why Henrietta went into psychoanalysis. I really wish I could be on that couch and have heard their conversations. But was it to sort out the loss of her mother? Was it to deal with her father's pressure on her to be enfolded into his world? Was it about her sexuality, which her Smith professor and lover said was no way to go through life because of the opprobrium it would call down? In any case, Ernest Jones took her on with relish. She was a fascinating and delightful and interesting subject, and he said, "I will bring her from women to men." And she did bring a man to spend Christmas of 1925 in Louisville. She did follow her father's urgings and started living in New York for a little bit in 1925. She was working for a theater magazine where John Mason Brown was writing criticism. And she came across there in New York a young, half-Jewish European guy who she had previously met at a London party, probably the one with the purple dress and the saxophone. But he was pursuing the grain trade. He was also an aspiring novelist, and in fact, the Wolf's Press had said they would publish his book if he would just pay for half the cost. And he didn't want to do that. He didn't have the money. His name was Jacques Haussmann. You all might recognize him as John Houseman, known as Orson Welles' early collaborator and winner of an Academy Award late in life for his role as Professor Kingsfield in The Paper Chase. There were over 100 letters from John Houseman to Henrietta in a trunk in the attic at my family home. So this has enabled me to help tell this part of the story. So he comes home for the holidays to this amazing Georgian mansion on a hill overlooking the Ohio River. Henrietta had sent him a telegram. She left New York and went to Louisville, and she said, "Jug band ordered, hurry, love H." And from a memoir that he wrote in the late 70s, I have a beautiful set of images of the time they spent together. This is just an image, a later image done by R. Crumb, the wonderful cartoonist, of Whistler and his jug band. And so there's a description of the two of them after a big party, probably at another club, going out during the Christmas holiday and not driving home, but instead driving miles and miles and miles out into the countryside until they rolled across a frozen cornfield. And there in a shack with one light lit was a jug band, the one she had promised. And they listened to that jug band and danced all night. And John Houseman says that as the second jug was emptied, the songs went from being happy songs to being low-down blues songs full of hate and anger. And it was his first exposure, close at hand, to the wellspring of so much of the great creativity of African Americans. And Whistler was a really special guy who unfortunately had a cocaine problem, which meant that he didn't get as far as some of the other jug bands. So the next morning, after that incredible night, he goes to Union Station in Louisville to make his way back to New York. And I'm going to read from his beautifully written, evocative description of that trip. "There was daylight on the snow when we got back to Glenview, and that afternoon I was driven into Louisville in a snowstorm to catch my train to New York. Henrietta was to go later, but at the last moment, after a series of mysterious feints and substitutions in which a number of black maids played an agitated and conspiratorial part, she emerged, smiling and alone, just as my train was pulling out from the drawing room of the car next to mine. Here we spent the night together. While we were in the dining car, the porter had made up our berths. We lay back after we had passed through Pittsburgh, sprawled side by side in the dark, with the sweetish odor of bourbon around us, and the mass of the upper berth hanging low and heavy over our heads. We talked through the night over the pounding of wheels, changing positions when we grew numb or felt the desire to kiss, or peer out from under the drawn shade at the gray, deserted platforms of the snow-covered fields beyond the misted panes. It was past midnight, and we were well into our second bottle when Henrietta began to talk about her childhood and finding herself, after her mother's death, occupying the dead woman's place at her father's side. The more she struggled to be free, the more deeply she became lost in an emotional maze that her father had built around her. Finally, they slept. And then he writes, I remember half in a dream, Henrietta opening her dress for me to put my hand on her breast. And I remember later waking to find her crying in her sleep, and the tears sliding, warm and slightly salt, across her cheek and into my mouth. So that leads me to my fourth part of our talk. And Hausman was clearly in love. He stayed in love with Henrietta for several years until she finally broke it off. And there were many, many, both concurrent before and after John Hausman. But Henrietta was clearly at odds with her father, and she wasn't happy. Most challenging, really, to the writing of this book for me was understanding and learning about the years following her father's death, really, years when the psychoanalysis that she had undergone in her 20s and even early 30s seemed not to have resolved the emotional difficulties that characterized her life. And I do like to think sometimes about how a person as incredibly vibrant and seductive and unforgettable as Henrietta could also be so broken as she was inside. And I actually have come to the conclusion that those two things go together. That it is when someone is terribly broken that they sometimes draw on these reserves to make themselves lovable and desirable, but also because they need that so badly, but they can't quite achieve intimacy and peace. And I do think that is part of her story. So my sources for this chapter in her life are from the 40s and 50s. They're some of them documents from the physicians who treated her. They're oral history from my family, my grandmother, my father, and others. My grandmother liked to say that, actually she was quoting my grandfather, that he said about Ernest Jones that he took Henrietta apart and never put her back together again. But I think it's a little more complicated than that. So I'm going to back up to 1932, really the high point in Henrietta's father's life. He's appointed as ambassador to England by Franklin Roosevelt, having contributed heavily to his campaign and his election. He was called Lord Byng by a lot of people, and this was considered a great plum to get this position, to be ambassador to the court of St. James. He said, reportedly, that he wouldn't take the position unless Henrietta joined him. So off they went. Here he is with his third wife, Aline, and Henrietta on the other side, arriving in Southampton to fanfare and welcome. It was an interesting period for her. She had a clear role, even though he was married and had a perfectly lovely wife. Henrietta was in charge of most of the entertainment at the embassy and also putting her father in touch and explaining to him a lot of the English society that she was very familiar with. And that role gave her, in some ways, greater stability than she had experienced since her mother had died. Meanwhile, here she is pictured with my grandfather, Barry Sr., around 1934, during that embassy time. Nice spats, right? they were always extremely close as siblings from early childhood, and he was taking on a role that her father had really offered her in the late 20s. He was the acting publisher of the paper while his father was in the position in England. So he was kind of taking care of that side of things while Henrietta was taking care of the sort of physical part of her father, his role in his presence in England. And while they were in the embassy, Henrietta met Helen Jacobs. Here she is in action at Wimbledon. In 1934, she was a 4-time US Open champion, and it was in the trunk, which you can actually see on exhibit at the Fraser, in their Prohibition exhibit. This trunk contained tennis clothes that told me that a sort of friendship with Helen Jacobs maybe was more than a friendship. So in that trunk, I found these shorts and this monogrammed shirt, HHJ. And it was when I sent those off to the Tennis Hall of Fame that I realized, that I learned that Helen Jacobs had diaries. Again, Henrietta was written all through these line-a-day diaries for several, like 5 years, from 7 years, sorry, from the mid-30s into the 40s. Helen Jacobs was brought into the family at the embassy. She called the ambassador Pa. She had her own room. I'm not sure she slept in it all the time. Henrietta taught her how to fox hunt. They became, in the press's words, close friends. And I think that both this lesbian couple in the mid-1930s in London enjoyed a sort of diplomatic immunity. They were in public together, a remarkable level of acceptance. And they had a dream of coming back to Kentucky together. Henrietta bought a farm, well, actually her father bought her a farm called Harmony Landing. And here you have the New York papers announcing the arrival of her string of English bloodstock. And they were going to set up and breed thoroughbreds in this beautiful place in the Kentucky countryside. Even though this was outside the bluegrass, Henrietta had known horses all her life, and in fact, her great uncle on her mom's side had bred 2 Derby winners, so she had her own lineage to be proud of in that department. Here's a picture of her with one of her broodmares and a foal in the late 30s. The thing that happened almost immediately, though, when this plan went into effect, is Robert Worth Bingham died. And with him went a certain kind of protection for Henrietta, and that was coterminous with an increasing intolerance in society. This is during the Depression, during the years of fascism, fascism's rise, for any kind of abnormal sexuality. Henrietta begins to hit the bottle, which we obviously know she already knew well, but she begins to hit the bottle harder, and Helen, her lover, begins to worry. World War II comes, and Helen goes into the Navy waves, becomes a lieutenant. She writes a book, which is, she's told to write a novel to help recruit other women. By Your Leave, Sir, it's called. And it starts on a horse farm on the banks of the Ohio in Kentucky. But Henrietta is left behind. Here she is in the American Women's Voluntary Services uniform, helping with the Victory Garden campaign. It was not nearly as fun as what her brother was doing in the OSS or her other lovers. Her lovers were doing, like Helen, getting posted in exciting places and doing exciting work. She did grow hemp for the war effort, and I really like to show off this incredible document. This is a special stamp permitting her to produce marijuana, which was at that time a scheduled controlled substance. She was growing it for the war effort at Harmony Landing. But It was also a time when my grandmother took her to the Central Hospital because she was having a breakdown, and these breakdowns they happened one after another. She worried she might have to slaughter her horses. She didn't know how to keep things going. And my grandfather wrote in a letter during the war to his wife, my grandmother, "It chills and disturbs me to think that I can't convert even a small part of my happiness into some form of benison for people close to me who need it as badly as Henrietta does." And they consulted a lot of doctors, and the chief of psychiatry in Louisville told them that she really needed to have shock therapy and perhaps a lobotomy. Henrietta resisted this suggestion, in fact, a great deal of pressure to undergo that treatment. She says in a letter back to her brother, "I have given the shock therapy a great deal of thought. I would do anything to avoid the cycles of depression and the serious consequences to my personal relationships." But she also argued that having shock therapy after the episode wasn't going to help. And frankly, I think her intuition on that part was very fortunate. It probably would have, the way it was administered in that time, had high risks. So in the late 1940s, she left Kentucky and never came back to live here. It became an impossible place for her to be who she was. And that was with great sadness. Here she is in a picture with the man she married briefly on the far left, Benjamin Franklin Mackenzie, and then Henrietta in the middle with her beauty obviously somewhat lost. I mean, she was never a traditional beauty, but she doesn't look as good there. She's then my grandfather, and then on his right is Henrietta's lover, Dorothy Holland, who remained with her to the end of her life. And I don't know who the last person is. But you can see that they've drunk the champagne, and Henrietta has on the plate in front of her a single glass of beer. This was called in our family the beer wagon. That Henrietta, when she wasn't supposed to be really drinking, but she could drink beer. And this was a document that I found among a smattering of papers that was in Henrietta's apartment when she died and was cleaned out by my aunt and kept, thankfully. These cycles of depression and dependence and breakdown did not end, and they were complicated by part of what you see on this list. This is a shopping list for little things that she needed, and at the end of the list of food and medicine and so forth are medications that are all serious psychoactive drugs prescribed to her by doctors that she went to see to help her. And she didn't know, and probably they didn't know, how addictive and debilitating they would be to her. So I'm almost done here. This is an image of Henrietta in the late 40s at Harmony Landing. She's got her arm around my father. Her brother is with her. Sally Bingham is by her father, and my Uncle Worth is next to my father. And this is the kind of image of Henrietta that absolutely vanished from my family. I've dug it out of, a collection of photographs that came to light that Sally had shared, but this just wasn't, she was gone. It was as if this never happened. Clearly she was a loved and valued part of the family, but as anyone who's gone through mental health problems with a loved one, it can be searing, and I think it was in the case of her, as well as a sexuality issue, which became very difficult to talk about. I asked my grandmother a lot of questions before she died, and here we are talking. She loved to talk, and she was very open with me about her feelings about Henrietta and her experiences. Today, and I'm so glad I did ask those questions, because I wouldn't be able to put this story together as I have, and it reminds me that we can discuss things around mental health and about sexuality, about the things that sometimes banish family members, whether it's, a criminal history or a bankruptcy, things that make people unspeakable. And to be fully compassionate, we really must ask those questions and bring those people back to the degree we can. My youngest child is named Jim. And he was asking me as I was going to my first party for this book, just before it was published, if I would tell him a story about Henrietta or what I was going to say. And I said, well, I'm going to tell a story. He said, well, tell me the story. I said, well, you'll hear it at the party. And he said, but I want to hear all the Henrietta stories. And I'm really glad that we have those stories together, if not all of them, a whole lot of them. Henrietta Bingham didn't accomplish the great things that her father, her teachers, and her lovers like John Houseman and Helen Jacobs, and going back to dear John Mason Brown and so many others expected of her. Nevertheless, she had an unforgettable impact. She was brave, she was flawed, and she was spectacular. And now she is out of the trunk and among us for good. Thank you. So I'm looking to our hosts if there's time for 1 or 2 or 3 questions. That's great. There's someone there? Thank you. Where was Henrietta's mother from? Her father was from North Carolina. So her mother was a Louisville-born, native-born to Louisville, and for about 3 or 4 generations, she was a native Louisvillian. Yeah, from going back 3 or 4 generations. Oh, Miller. Yes, that was her name, Eleanor Miller, and she was related to the Long family as well. Yeah, her mother was a Long, and that's really where the money was. Her father was married into that family. So the question is, I claim in my preface that I didn't make anything up. I didn't embellish or fictionalize or put words in anyone's mouth. I mean, I am a trained historian. That's what I do. If I were a fiction writer, I probably could turn this into a good novel. It's just not what I do. I do believe there's a place for using the documents you have and the information you have and the evidence you have to piece together a story. Of course, it's still a story, and I can't claim that I've found the truth because there are so many things that I don't know. But I believe in that process of using what we can to build a story for which you have evidence and support. And that's what I teach my students when I teach. That doesn't mean there isn't great value in historical fiction, creative nonfiction. I love, you could maybe call this that, but because I'm building story, but I pride myself and I feel like it does an honor to the past when we can use not only our emotional intelligence, which of course we all bring to that writing, but also just really work hard to find the pieces that can, and be creative about finding the pieces that can help us understand and get back into another time. So how long did it take me to write the book? I decided that I wanted to write a book on a mountain in 2008. I just said, my child was born in '98, so 10 years later, all these stories have been coming. I'd poked around a little here and there, and I had a lot of doubts and a lot of hesitation about writing this book, but I made that decision. So it took 7 years to publication for that, yes. I mean, I quote my son, Jim, who's 12. My mother is here. I have yet to have a family member be anything but incredibly supportive. And I do think it would have been a hard book to write 20 years ago, even maybe 10 years ago. So as I was in the course of researching and writing, it was almost as if the culture were just loading onto me so much new ideas and openness around sexuality and respect for LGBT people, and I felt very fortunate to be operating in that atmosphere. I think I would have written the book anyway, but it wouldn't have had the reception that it had. I mean, it came out within a week of the Obergefell's decision, a Supreme Court decision last summer, and that just set an incredible precedent. I like to say that Henrietta's second coming out party was probably a lot more relaxed than her first in terms of who she really was. And I also am very careful to not pigeonhole Henrietta Bingham as a lesbian or anything. I don't know exactly what she felt. I know that she had relationships with men and women, that both sexes were incredibly attracted to her. She was married even briefly. But I think one of the things that we're moving towards in this era is more ability to not freeze people's identities and look at sexuality as something that is a breathing aspect of life, and it doesn't have to always fall into certain current that can change for people, or it can be more fluid. And a lot, if you look on college campuses today, that's exactly what people are calling for. So, that good? Thank you so much for your patience, for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, so much. She will be over here to my left for her book signing. While you're there visiting with her, please take a moment to enjoy some of the things from the collection of KHS over here to my left. See Stephen in the back if you're interested in a brick or a leaf, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Thanks.